Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this online symposium hosted by the Association of Caribbean Copyright Societies, ACCESS, and the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies. Today, we'll be talking under the theme Music, Innovation, and Economic Development. I will be the moderator. My name is Erica Smith. And I apologize for the slightly late start. We, of course, had a little technical difficulty, but thank you for joining us. Just a few house rules. The chat feature will not be on, and we will be taking all questions through the question and answer feature. I ask that you write your questions in advance and allow us to finish the presentations, and there will be a full question and answer segment at the end. So to start this morning's proceedings, I have Dr. Carrington, who is the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cape Hill. Unfortunately, Professor Lorde could not join us, but I asked Dr. Carrington to kindly give his opening remarks. Dr. Carrington?
Okay, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I bring you greetings on behalf of Professor Troy Lorde, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and extend best wishes to you on this symposium on music, innovation, and economic development. Based on empirical evidence, the development of the music industry in the 20th century was characterized by two large structural breaks. The first is that of the jazz revolution in the 1920s, and the second one, the rock and roll revolution in the early 1950s. Here within the Caribbean, our music industry was seeing developments in the area of reggae in Jamaica with icons such as Marley and Tosh, and in Trinidad, soca and calypso with people like the Mighty Sparrow. And Barbados tried a little bit with spooge, the late Jackie Opel being one of the pioneers of this genre. The fundamental change in the music industry saw with conditions of production, distribution, and reception that triggered a complex interaction of different factors. And these innovations have propelled the music industry to a billion-dollar industry, contributing significantly to the gross domestic products of many countries. Historically, the introduction of broadcasting towards the beginning of the 1920s, where radio was process innovation, serving as the foundation for novel production methods. This altered production logic between broadcasting and the phonography industry exhibits focus on the production of music in material forms such as records. Then we had live broadcast music from concert halls and ballrooms taking center stage. But here within the Caribbean, the development of our festivals took center stage that contributed significantly to the economic development of the region. The loss of Barbados crop over in 2020, the possible loss of 2021 Carnival in Trinidad speaks to the economic contribution of music to this region. However, today, innovations have enabled us to download music on the go. There's, for example, the Apple Music Store. So even the CD, which replaced the cassette tape recorder, which had replaced vinyl records, have further propelled this industry as we can now purchase music on our various devices, and the ability to do so with just the press of a finger is a further testimony of innovations that have enhanced the economic development of nations through music. Traditionally, record production required control over 5 basic elements. First, the rights to exploit intellectual property. Second, the technical preconditions for recording. Third, the technical equipment to produce records. Fourth, costly distribution methods for what was then very fragile phonographs. And fifth, the appropriate marketing in order to call customers' attention to the music productions. However, in contrast with the development of the radio broadcasting, which required control of musicians rather than the copyrights of the music they played. In technical terms, radio needed an appropriate broadcasting infrastructure and had to ensure that music recipients had access to the necessary receivers. Distribution occurred directly, and the broadcasting networks were able to regulate it due to the medium's serial quality. Radio relied on marketing only to a limited degree to disseminate its content, since advertising clients took care of this. In short, where broadcasting was based on different laws than the ones that apply to the production of records, but today, broadcasting is so diverse and access to music has changed. This resulted in entities in Barbados such as COSCAP being here to regulate and ensure that musicians get their share of the revenues due to them as their intellectual property. So this symposium on music, innovation, and economic development is not only relevant and important, but is very timely as the region seeks to grapple with declining sources of revenue due to the coronavirus pandemic. And we can look to see how innovations within the music industry and our music festivals can continue to contribute to the gross domestic product of our fragile economies. So I wish you every success in this symposium as you seek to marry music, innovation, and economic development.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carrington. And we'll move quickly ahead with Dr. Don Marshall, who is the Director and Senior Research Fellow of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill campus. Don holds a PhD in International Political Economy and is the author and/or editor of 3 books, 5 monographs, and several scholarly articles in esteemed journals. He sits on the editorial boards of key international journals, such as the University of Helsinki's Globalizations, the University of London's Progress and Development Studies, and the University of the West Indies Journal of Eastern Caribbean Studies. His research interests are linked to issues around globalization and development. And I must acknowledge the tremendous gratitude we have for Dr. Marshall's cooperation with ACCESS in making this all possible. Don? You need to unmute, Don.
Broken the first rule. Greetings, everyone, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And may I say, Erica, that it is and remains a pleasure working with you and with ACCS, as well as the copyright communities throughout the Caribbean, copyright management communities throughout the Caribbean. I should say that it's a welcome, as Donnelly Carrington would have mentioned, it's a welcome in large part from the University of the West Indies community. The ideas that were discussed with Erica and myself in relation to looking at music innovation and economic and or national development stem from the notion that there is a greater need especially now that we have our Faculty of Culture in place, a greater need to intervene in discussions about national economic innovation and renewal in ways that keep pace with moving forward with legacy. We are a region of rhythm and tempo. I like to identify myself in that way to various audiences that I am a Caribbean person, born in Barbados, but I come from a region filled with rhythm and tempo, and it defines everything I do. Our language is in our music, our vernacular is our music, our vibe, our energy, who we are. These are essential elements of that are pressed into play when we talk about our music. Now, and the question of our innovation is something that still remains an unheralded story. However, the link between SALISES and COSCAP, essentially, or the link between SALISES and the question of copyright is critical because as the previous speaker alluded, it is important that we harness the gains, the rightful gains that our musicians and our artists and so on that are due them for their creative works. And there has been a long discussion about the creative industries and how we augment that. There's been a long discussion about the power of our music, its reach, the global icons that we have gifted to the world or bequeathed to the world. But we have not been, the underside of that story is one where we have not always harnessed the potential from the fact that we promote this very powerful music. Bob Marley engaged a re-enchantment of the world through reggae. And in many ways, much of the innovation that's attributed to modern popular music can be captured in the personage of Rihanna, including her connections, but definitely her agency has played a large part in reshaping and remapping boundaries of understanding, remapping and reshaping a woman's right to be, remapping and reshaping the sense of Caribbean youth culture and the many ways in which we express ourselves as a people, capturing her music and her lyrics and her symbolic representations, and in her manner, her manner in terms of owning her fashion, owning her creative entrepreneur energies. And not since Grace Jones have we had a Caribbean icon of symbolic popular appeal as we have had in Rihanna. And this is the power of the music. And sometimes through music, we don't capture well enough how our entrepreneurs, our musical entrepreneurs, define or redefine what innovation really means. And hopefully in this discussion today, as we bring to bear our range of disciplines or different orientations and so on, we will be able to facilitate for those that are plugged in a vibrant conversation that will engender a vibrancy around why we should continue to harness and seek to build on those structures that allow for our artists to get their just deserts. Thank you very much and welcome all.
Thank you, Don. Next, we have Mr. John Arnold, who is the president of the ACCS. John is Trinidadian, and he holds a bachelor's degree in industrial management from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, a professional certificate in event management from the George Washington University, a certificate in hospitality studies and marketing, an executive MBA from the Arthur Lorde Japp Global School of Business, and he's currently a Doctor of Business Administration at the Arthur Lorde Japp School. John is very, very active in the music industry. He's the chairman of Music TT Board. He lectures in event management. And as I said, he's also our president, and he's done a fantastic job. John, a few remarks, please.
Yeah. Morning, everyone. Great morning to everyone. The copyright industry is facing a very serious time all across the globe as COVID-19 takes us on a journey that's certainly unpredictable at this time. The ACCS has been working hard over the last 12 months to ensure the best of life for the creatives, and namely those would be, of course, the composers, writers, publishers, performers, and producers. I want to just highlight some of the areas that we've been working on that we think that would obviously redound to greater benefits to all, not only during COVID, but certainly post-COVID. Some of the items that we've been looking at: capacity strengthening, revenue generation, digital licensing. We've actually worked with Latino Tour, regional licensing policy. We're still looking at that, tariff setting, which we'll hear a little more about from Vanus today. Regional training programs, which would be online, a mixture of online. enhancing visibility of ACCS, strengthening the membership with other organizations, for example, JAMS, monetizing creativity in the post-COVID era, the elements with WIPO and CSAC, the WIPO Connect, and of course, CMO regulation. So those are some of the areas that we have covered over the last 12 months and that as we have been paying attention to. And in that regard, there's several workshops that we have attended. UNESCO CARIFORUM Regional Workshop on Preferential Treatment for the Caribbean, CARIFORUM Workshop on Music Digitization, the Accelerator, and some also attended the No-Code Regional Training Program. The major points to note, or one of the major points to note, would be that the ACCS has been working assiduously to ensure that as a region, we work collaboratively as we seek the common interest of securing more revenue for membership. There's a great effort to educate, build capacity, and allow for the innovative ideas to flourish in an atmosphere of free and fair discussion. The challenges are many, and we have to stare down the barrel of an unpredictable future and be determined that despite the uncertain times, we will look for the opportunities, we will work 24 hours a day, we will collaborate, we will seek competencies to help us, we will see the possibilities, we will not sleep, and finally, in all that we do, we will honor our commitment to the creators, our members who depend on us to represent them and the music that they put forward in the Caribbean. Today, we look forward to this great symposium and to the participants and the contributors as we look at music, innovation, and the economics. Together, we will all be stronger. I thank you.
Thank you, John. Today's presentation by Dr. James comes out from a study he did on behalf of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and it was commissioned for the benefit of the Access members. So we have a lot to thank WIPO for in terms of their sponsorship of that study. And representing the organization is Anita Huss. She is working as a counselor at the World Intellectual Property Organization in the copyright and creative industry sector, which is in the Copyright Management Division in Geneva, Switzerland. And she works in the area of collective management of copyright and related rights specifically. Before joining WIPO in 2015, she worked as Deputy Secretary General and General Counsel of the International Federation of Reproduction Rights Organizations, which is known as IFRO, and was based in Brussels. Anita is a German qualified attorney with 3 postgraduate law degrees from King's College London, and that is the LLM in EU, US, and UK copyright law. Uppsala University in Sweden, where she did an LLM in international and comparative law, and Stockholm University with an LLM in European law. Anita also gained experience at major international law firms in Belgium, Germany, and Sweden, working as a corporate transaction and competition lawyer. So very well qualified, but also a very, very kind lady, very kind to the region. Anita, a few words from you, please.
Thank you so much, Erica, for this very kind introduction, I hope. Dear Dr. Carrington, dear Dr. Marshall, Mr. Arnold, dear Professor Hamilton, dear Vanus, and of course, dearest Erica, distinguished speakers and participants, thank you so much to ACCS for this kind invitation addressed to the World Intellectual Property Organization. It is my honor to represent WIPO on this occasion, and we are grateful to ACCS for providing this opportunity to share our remarks at this interesting and timely online policy symposium on music, innovation, and economic development. Copyright law gives right holders, authors, composers, and publishers, as well as the owners of related rights in sound recordings, the right to negotiate tariffs and collect revenues from the public performance and other users of their musical works. However, managing copyright and related rights individually may not always be realistic. An author, performer, or producer cannot contact every single radio station to negotiate licenses and remuneration for the use of their songs. On the other side, it is not practical for a radio station to seek specific permission from every author, performer, and producer for the use of each song. Collective management organizations, or CMOs, facilitate rights clearance in the interest of both parties and provide economic rewards for rights holders. Thus, individual and collective management are complementary. Ultimately, what matters is that rights management is effective and efficient in the interest of right holders and users alike. With ACCS and the WIPO member states in the Caribbean, we have been working over the past months on a project to assist on a tariff setting methodology for the music CMOs in the Caribbean. The Caribbean islands have such a rich and diverse cultural history. The music and the festivals of the Caribbean are famous around the world. There are several different styles of music that originate from your beautiful islands. The genres include the mento, the salsa, and the reggae, and so many other styles. Caribbean music has influenced the European and American music to a great extent. The renowned Caribbean carnivals and music festivals are widely photographed and broadcast, which popularized the Caribbean music even further, thereby influencing modern music, including hip hop and R&B throughout the world. And people here also like to listen to music from abroad, which creates a great and vibrant overall cultural experience. ACCS is a very important organization, aiming at promoting synergies on a regional level. We observe this as a current trend throughout other parts of the world, with right holders coming together, creating licensing hubs across borders, enabling the exploitation of a growing pool of repertoire under a single license. This is not always easy and can only work if licenses are offered to users that meet their needs and expectations. There is, of course, a need to balance any role at a regional level and the tasks that are likely best done locally, such as member recruitment, documentation of the domestic repertoire, implementing local laws and regulations, or terrestrial licensing. It is up to ACCS to determine where synergies allow to mutualize or approximate the services regionally in the interest of all. Of course, this needs to be seen in view of the Caribbean economic context, and we very much welcome the contribution by the economic expert, Mr. Vanus James. It is also important to be aware of the international practices, especially as users want to license both the domestic and the international repertoire, whereas right holders want the domestic repertoire to be licensed both in the region and overseas. Ultimately, it is up to you, the Caribbean CMOs, to decide on your own systems in view of the local needs in your specific context. That is an efficient and effective system for all parties and stakeholders. WIPO remains ready to support ACCS and the Caribbean countries throughout the process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. I will now do a short presentation, which I hope serves as an introduction to the key speaker today. And what I want to say is that whilst I focus on copyright and music specifically, the comments can generally be applied to other areas in the creative industries and other forms of intellectual property. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of coordination now, as I will share my screen with a PowerPoint. Okay. So copyright. Copyright is an automatic right which subsists for original literary and artistic expressions which have been captured in some medium. So there's no question that creative activity is dependent on copyright, nor is copyright a prerequisite for creativity. So for example, we have calypso, we have reggae, we have Aboriginal art, all of which developed without a reliance on copyright. The argument I'm presenting here today is that there is a strong case to be made for supporting the copyright system as a strategy for sustainable industry development. The premise of copyright is that through the grant of monopoly rights to individuals for their original creative expressions, they're incentivized to continue creating new works, ultimately for the benefit of all mankind. IP rights serve to constrain market failure arising from free riding, for example, piracy and counterfeiting. And it secures the flow of income to the rights holder. Registered intellectual property rights, including copyright, serve as proof of property with which creators can enter legal transactions. What I want to say today is that it is necessary for us in the region to reframe our thinking on intellectual property rights, or IPRs, moving them to the center of policy development by understanding the role IPRs play and how best to utilize them to achieve our objectives, whether for the creative industries in terms of copyright, agriculture, where we look at geographical indications, new plant varieties, access to medicines in terms of patents, education, entrepreneurship, and innovation. So what do I mean when I speak of the creative industries? These were defined in a well-known paper of the UK Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport in 1998 as those activities which have their origin in individual creativity, skill and talent, and which have the potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. So you will see that it explicitly links creativity, wealth creation, and intellectual property. The core industries, the WIPO, they have a definition which is based on the copyright industries model. And this includes what they define as the core copyright industries, which would be like music, film and video, performing arts, software. The interdependent copyright industries, including, for example, consumer electronics, and the partial copyright industries, which would extend to clothing, household goods, and architecture. So they're varying definitions, but the point is that there's this linkage between copyright or intellectual property rights and the creative industries. So in terms of the Caribbean and its history with IP, we've had intellectual property legislation since colonial times in the early 20th century. And Okidiji argues that this was not for the benefit of locals, however, but rather that the extension of intellectual property laws to the colonies was for purposes generally associated with the overarching colonial strategies of assimilation, incorporation, and control. And given the colonial treatment of non-Europeans as subjects rather than citizens of the European power, these laws could not be applied to or for local citizens. Even at the decisive moment of independence, intellectual property laws were not directed at the domestic innovation environment, but were rather projected outwards to foreign nations who would benefit from protection. Developing countries, in essence, service the international system and not vice versa. With independence, there was some work done to craft and develop laws and institutions specific to the needs of nation building. Intellectual property laws, however, generally continue to follow the model of the former metropole. The IP system was a low priority or a no priority matter. Meanwhile, as the information age developed and trade in services and intangibles and the interconnectedness between countries grew, which is known as globalization, there was an aggressive push to ensure that rights holders of IPRs, primarily from developed countries, could effectively protect their rights and continue to benefit therefrom in the global environment. The results of this push were the establishment of the World Trade Organization and the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreement, which is known as the TRIPS agreement. so that intellectual property was firmly positioned as a key component of the international trading system, where each WTO member, whether a country or customs territory, had adopted a TRIPS agreement. That agreement established minimum standards of protection for WTO members. And as a result, we saw the revision of IP legislation around the world, including in the Caribbean, and the growth in institutions such as the Copyright Collective Management Organizations to facilitate the exercise of rights and the administration of benefits. There were some allowances made for developing and least developed countries in terms of the time they had to implement the standards of TRIPS. Ghana, however, in 1995 described the TRIPS agreement as a form of passive coercion. That is, the requirement that third world societies establish particular forms of protection for intellectual goods as a condition to membership in the new multilateral trading system. Post-TRIPS, we have seen several bilateral agreements which have promoted even higher standards than the TRIPS agreements did. And in response to all of this, there's been a lot of criticism and active pushback. And we saw the establishment of the development agenda of WIPO and the emergence of various models such as Creative Commons, which were touted as being more suited to the actualities of developing countries. So under these circumstances, it is legitimate to question the validity of the IPR system for developing countries and to assess alternatives or at least improvements. But this is all against a background of an increasingly strong position of IPRs in global trade, and also the fact that developing countries, including the Caribbean, have signed the various agreements and made the required commitments. So what does this mean? Is copyright good or is it bad? So if we accept the connection made between the creative industries and IP or copyright, which was given in the definitions above or before, what are the implications of the copyright system for our region in terms of economic development? And the reality is that copyright in the Caribbean is difficult to enforce with high levels of infringement. It generates low levels of returns to regional rights holders, and generally it is not well supported. So Pager did a study on the role of copyright in the creative industries of Nigeria, China, and India, which were birthed outside of the copyright system. And based on his findings, we could very well include the case of Jamaica reggae as another example. What he found was that whilst copyright was not necessary in the infant stages of industry development, once creative industries in developing countries reach a certain point, they tend to embrace copyright formalization, which he called a crossover point, where the benefits of copyright surpass the cost. He found that in Nigeria, or let's say Jamaica, what was demonstrated was a danger of an informality trap that impedes formalization and hinders long-term development through a reliance on informal systems. In the absence of a functioning copyright system, what you see is a dependence on informal disciplinary measures. It is difficult to establish ownership. There's cannibalization of sales. There's negative impact resulting from low levels of investment, which in turn lead to low quality. There's short recovery periods, downward pressure on prices. Creators are not the ones who actually benefit from piracy. There's a continuous shortage of funds and high volume, low margin production. It is my position that those all characterize the Caribbean music industry, and perhaps other areas in the creative industries in the region. So, on the other hand, whilst we recognize copyright and IP generally as constructs of the developed world, which developing countries, if they are to participate in the global trade system, must implement, what we found is that the implementation is often with little thought, it is weak, and it is generally in an abstract manner, which is disconnected from national economic development strategies. Certainly in the case of copyright, and given my experience in the Caribbean, this has largely been treated as a nuisance by those who want to access protected works. And because of the lack of support, you find that even the creative community fights against copyright. More generally, for other forms of intellectual property rights, so trademarks, patents, etc., these seem to be treated solely as sources of revenue from registrations and renewals from international rights holders for the Central Treasury and little more. Yes, the legislation has been enacted, but the enforcement of rights in practice is very difficult, and as I keep saying, with very few support mechanisms. The lack of awareness and consideration for copyright in the region is reflected in the measures which are implemented to assist where creators are not earning from their work without an understanding of the potential effects. So in other words, the system doesn't work, there's market failure, and there are interventions which seek to assist in other ways. What Pedro notes is that any ancillary revenues to subsidize the production of creative content is vulnerable to distortions where the proxy or substitute market represents an imperfect substitute for the social value of the primary good. It correctly raises the sustainability of this if the substitute market disappears. And in the case of music, when I was thinking about this, the first thing that came to mind in terms of Barbados was the distorting effect of Propover or Carnival. And the focus that is given as a form of revenue generation in a territory with very low levels of sales and very few revenue generating opportunities outside of the Carnival season. And it also has an effect in terms of the diversity in our music with an increasing focus on soca. On the other hand, with the recognition of a crossover point where copyright offers net value to creators in developing countries, this means that it is incumbent on the region to ensure that it creates a framework that allows the IP or copyright system to work to its benefit. Most regional governments and CARICOM have accorded the creative industries priority status. But for this to be meaningful, we must strategically incorporate intellectual property rights as tools to aid development. And I define development by referencing Sustainable Goal 8.3, which speaks to the promotion of development-oriented policies that support productive activities, decent job creation, entrepreneurship, creativity, and innovation, and encourage the formalization and growth of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, including through access to financial services. What is required is innovation in policy development, building the required support infrastructure, and an investment in understanding the political economy of the regional creative industries to shape and inform a regional copyright system which is responsive to our needs within the constraints of the international IP system. And to wrap up, I make a few recommendations. So we need to really invest in increased capacity building so that policy and decision makers understand the implication of intellectual property rights. We need legislation that specifically considers the region's needs and looks at, for example, the effective implementation of the flexibilities which are in fact available in the various international treaties. And this is come to the fore in the current pandemic because we need to be able to access those flexibilities to address issues such as how do we ensure continued access to knowledge and information. We need to implement institutional support through well-functioning and well-resourced intellectual property offices rather than treating them as mere collection agencies. We need functioning copyright tribunals, and we need to increase the support extended to the regional copyright organizations. So in summary, what we need is to make better use of the system with effective implementation. We should undertake impact assessments and evaluations to inform any changes we make to our IP system, rather than simply following the models of other countries and the dictates of trade agreements. And that is my brief and hopefully informative presentation. Okay, so you didn't hear me. I would like to now turn over to Dr. James. Dr. James is a former senior policy advisor to the UNDP and World Intellectual Property Organization, where he has functioned as an international consultant. He also served as senior research fellow in the Scotiabank Chair in Entrepreneurship and Development, and adjunct distinguished professor of economics and econometrics at the University of Technology, Jamaica. Dr. James is the author of 3 WIPO reports measuring the contribution of copyright-based industries to Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the OACS, as well as the author of the UN ECLAC manual, the design and conduct of public expenditure reviews in Caribbean countries. The central thesis of his published articles in referee journals and books is that the main development problem of Caribbean countries is that the domestic capital sector is too small. Welcome, Vanus. I want to say personally, thank you for accepting the invitation to speak. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your contribution to the region.
Thank you, Erica. And let me begin by congratulating yourself and John and Don for putting on this symposium. And let me also thank our colleagues at WIPO in Geneva for supporting the event. And then, of course, it's good enough to welcome all participants to what is essentially an advocacy event. I guess we ought to be blunt with Caribbean society and say that we are really severely underutilizing the development potential of the music industry. You pretty much could go around every corner and encounter in every Caribbean island a super talent like our own John Arnold here that is really being underexploited from the standpoint of income creation, employment creation, and trade. And I fervently hope that this advocacy event will make a significant difference in this difficult advocacy landscape that we have in the region. So congrats again for putting on, and all success wished. What are we trying to do in the Caribbean? We've long said that we're trying to develop. And we've understood for some time since Arthur Lewis that this is a process of eliminating underemployment and increasing the standard of living of citizens through a process of self-sustaining growth and sustainable management of indebtedness. And we've long known also that environmental sustainability is a necessary correlate of that process. Now, you achieve economic development through a process of capital accumulation, investment that results in two critical changes in your economic landscape. One is the growth of the marginal product of labor and consequently the marginal product of capital to consistently increase the domestic savings rate, net of taxes, somewhere beyond 15% of GDP. So that would then also allow an increased flow of revenues to governments. And we want to also grow our exports relative to imports in order to slacken the balance of payments, the foreign exchange constraint on growth. And what we have had to work hard to discover is that the world is a competitive place, and the central mechanism by which investment generates these changes successfully is growth of our capacity to compete on the global landscape. For a long time in the post-colonial mindset, we thought that you could just talk about development and wish for it and it would come along. But what we now know is that we've got to build our capacity to compete on the global stage in order to achieve development. And that may come as something of a surprise to policymakers in the region if you take as an indicator of their stance their disposition to the music industry itself. So the critical observation that we have to make about this business of the growth of our capacity to compete is that it essentially means growth of the capacity to implement what I like to call from my mathematical models, competitive strategy in the form of piecewise continuous technical adjustment, and what in broad language means growth of the capacity to innovate. Anyone who knows anything about the music industry knows that it thrives purely by innovation. Surely the music industry in the Caribbean space. And growth of this capacity to participate in piecewise continuous technical adjustment is achieved by growing the output of domestic capital. Music is a prime creator and producer of domestic capital relative to investment, relative to all other output, and as a share of exports. That is the central principle of the famous economic restructuring or economic diversification we've wished for in this region for so long. And if you want it in formal economic language, the central principle underlying that proposition is that domestic capital production, not manufacturing, is the engine of self-sustaining growth and development. Economists in the region would be familiar with propositions out of Britain from Lord Caldo that it's manufacturing that is credited with that role of the engine of development. But in our experience in the region, it's a much richer idea, the idea of being able to produce and trade with domestic capital. Now, if you take that proposition and you probe the data with it, you find some startling results. And I have been able to use the historical evidence of 3 Caribbean countries to check that, to see what it tells us. What is the impact of the capacity to innovate on trade, for example, in Caribbean countries? In the case of Barbados, I have produced evidence to show that a 1% increase in the capacity to innovate reduces imports, displaces imports by 0.19%, while growing exports by 0.21%. So that's a net gain if you invest in building your capacity to innovate over there in Barbados. In the case of Jamaica, you get a 1% increase in the capacity to innovate, reducing imports by 0.9%, 0.09%, while growing exports by 0.08%. So there again, you could see Jamaica has something to benefit from growing its capacity to innovate. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the figures are similar, although a little bit better. A 1% growth in the capacity to innovate would grow exports by 0.25% and would reduce imports by 0.31%. Overall, the general principle is there is a net gain in all Caribbean countries from building this capacity to innovate. And the capacity to innovate is the only economic factor I have been able to identify that fosters growth in the Caribbean through this twin effect on exports and imports. Remember, this is a region in which foreign exchange shortage is a crippling factor. So if you know that this is the gain you make from the capacity to innovate, you'll be able to achieve your self-sustaining growth, so to say, then you should make a beeline for whatever industries will exhibit this enormous capacity, enormously important capacity in your growth efforts. Now, I have computed some scaling parameters to give you a sense of how much we need to do and how much we need to seize every effort to grow our capacity to innovate. In the case of Barbados, if you hold the level of investment fixed or have it growing, it would take 125% increase in the domestic capacity to innovate to increase the rate of economic growth in Barbados by 1% through the joint effects on exports and imports. So there's a lot of work to be done there. In Jamaica, it would take about a 230% increase in the domestic capacity to innovate to increase the rate of growth by 1% through those same joint effects on exports and imports. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, a 52% increase is required in the domestic capacity to innovate in order to increase the rate of economic growth by 1% through the joint effects on exports and imports. There's been some parallel corroborating data available from the Global Innovation Index produced by WIPO and Cornell and other collaborating agencies. And what that study clarifies is that there are certain inputs into innovation that we can identify. One is the upgraded systems of education to produce qualified experimenters and researchers, upgraded healthcare systems, other applicable human capital, and in particular, upgrade of the creative inputs into the IP producing creative industries. You also need inputs in the form of relevant capital infrastructure, some of which you produce through the local capital producing sector that I have identified there, the domestic capital producing sector. And some, of course, in the Caribbean case, much is imported. So the critical contribution of the local capital producing sector must be recognized in that context. The development of business processes, the development of supporting institutions, and the development of markets. These are the critical inputs identified by the Global Innovation Index. Now, if you identify our performance on this index, you will see we're really very far behind the curve. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago in 2018, the index ranked Trinidad and Tobago at a low 86 out of 126 countries, although Trinidad and Tobago is classified as an economy with a high GDP per capita in excess of $18,000 per person. Jamaica, of course, is reputed for its music, but it doesn't fare much better. It has a rank of 83 out of 126, and it's ranked globally as an upper middle GDP per capita country. Barbados doesn't appear in the GII data, neither do the OECS economies. Now, the Global Innovation Index also identifies two classes of innovative outputs generated with those innovative inputs: physical capital, knowledge and technology on the one hand, and other creative outputs, broadly classified on the other. And all of these creative outputs yield intellectual property, as Erica has been identifying. Now, On the Innovation Output Index in 2018, Trinidad and Tobago achieved a rank of 104 out of 126 countries. Jamaica was a little better at 76 out of 126 countries. And then, of course, the Global Innovation Index computes an overall innovation index as the average of the input index and the as the ratio of the output index to the input index. And on this measure, Trinidad and Tobago attained a very low rank of 96 out of 126 countries. Jamaica, 86 out of 126 countries. So from the perspective of the gains from the investment in the capacity to innovate, the task is clear. They are there, but we have to work hard to get them. Now, when you take the overall measure of the efficiency of investment in innovative inputs identified by the GII, Trinidad and Tobago has a rank of 114 out of 126. That's pathetic. Jamaica has a rank of 80 out of 126. So that's better than Trinidad and Tobago, but nothing to write home about in the context of the global competition for effort for development. Now, what you find here is that Jamaica's indicators signal very weak innovation performance, and Trinidad and Tobago's indicators signal pathetic performance despite being such a high GDP per capita country. So what we need to think about here now is the key. What is the key to these low rankings? And my answer to that from my modeling is that it's low production of capital. Our domestic capital sector is simply too small and unfocused to drive our development in the way we need the sector to do. Now, let me be clear what I mean by capital. It's any output that's used as an input in production of goods and services. And music is particularly well understood to be such an output. It's used widely in producing all sorts of services. And generally, there are three broad forms of capital output. One is the short-term form, working capital. Musicians in the Caribbean will tell you how much they are starved of working capital in order to get their music production efforts going. Working capital in the ordinary accounting sense that John understands very well, net of current assets and current liabilities. If you're going to build new initiatives in order to develop, you've got to increase this systematically in commensurate with any expanded long-term capital assets. And the long-term capital assets that you have to accumulate in order to develop are assets that are expected to generate income over a long period of time, over many operating cycles. Usually when we do investment planning, we look over 15 to 20 years. One of those long-term capital forms would be, of course, the plant and the equipment and the tools and the infrastructure. Musicians know that very well in the form of their pianos and their guitars and their multi-stage, multi-stack basses and stuff like that. And when you think of the Caribbean's capacity to produce long-term capital, we're pretty weak here. This is where we are weakest, and we tend to have to import most of our inputs into our music and other economic efforts. Now, that's because, of course, of the weak manufacturing sector that we have, and this might well be the clue to any idea that manufacturing could be the engine of growth. And manufactured output itself is a form, in many ways, of capital inputs into production of other things. So that feeds nicely into my narrative. The second long-term form, and the most critical long-term form for Caribbean countries, is this business of problem-solving knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and the capacities to work, to advertise, to brand, to promote, and so on. Broadly speaking, people call that human capital, but it's much more enlightening to think of it in terms of knowledge and skills and work disposition and competitive attitude and stuff like that. And in this regard, Caribbean countries can hold out if we are appropriately committed to competitive strategy. Our main capital producing industries are our education sector, education industries, healthcare, the creative industries Erica spoke about, and the epitome here is music and entertainment. Most of the capital that these industries produce can be used in production of other things, including tourism, and could be exported on the tourism platform of the Caribbean region. Now, if you think of the current environment with COVID, you would find that rapid development of the healthcare industries may turn out to be it appears to be emerging as a precondition, healthcare for export, if you like, as a necessary correlative of development and export of things like education and the creative industries and tourism. We're coming face to face with that. You could see the fundamental argument I'm making is that we should never have in any case be in this position where our healthcare system is not one of the stellar international healthcare industries on which we anchor our efforts to persuade the world to come here to enjoy our music and our creative offerings. So now we have to confront that. That's a platform in and of itself. Now, more important, there is a sequencing to the process of piecewise continuous technical progress that our research has identified and that Caribbean countries need to pay a lot of attention to. The first critical thing you have to do in building competitive strategy in the form of piecewise continuous technical adjustment is that you have to grow knowledge, skills, worker disposition, attitude to competition in workers and management and so on, entrepreneurship and so on. That's the first thing. Then having done that, you bring the long-term physical capital up to speed to fall in line with the additional knowledge, increased knowledge and skills and attitudes that you bring. And then of course, you bring working capital in line with both of those. And the critical thing that we have to observe when we are studying piecewise continuous technical progress is that a country cannot implement optimal competitive strategy by simply following the rest of the world in all areas. Because if you do, we can show that that would lead to perpetual balance of payments deficits and accumulating debt, which, not surprising to anyone, is the broad-based experience of Caribbean countries because we've under-invested our souls in building our capacity to compete. If you want to avoid that fate, a country must lead in some areas of the continuous technical progress effort. Now, in the Caribbean, that's where music comes in. Music lives by providing this kind of leadership, right? Music and the related entertainment industry. And I've had the privilege since 2000 of working with UNCTAD and WIPO to study this industry from this perspective. From the start, that's the perspective I brought to the work that Demeter and Jelka Kozelwright and more recently Anita invited me to do. And here's what I found summarily. The first most important observation is when you scan the global landscape, the Caribbean is one of the global talent hubs for music innovation, right? And what that means is we export music to the world and we import music. So it's a global talent hub that facilitates the reliance on music to participate in the bulk of global trade, which is intra-industry trade. You sell me one type of music, I sell you another type, and we see who could make the most profit from that deal. But you have to invest energetically in holding your own in that kind of competition. And Caribbean musicians across the board know that very well. And they behave as though they know that. Every year, they bring new offerings to the world. That's the hallmark. Music, of course, is critically to be studied as a capital form. And it involves the creative output of the authors and the composers and publishers that Erica was talking about, as well as the producers of sound recordings that's used as inputs into other activities like distribution to households, distribution to customers of production plants, offices, and so on. And of course, use in establishment events like bashments and fetes and carnivals and a wide range of festivals. The iconic creations of our music industry was mentioned before by Dr. Carrington and Erica: reggae, calypso, soca, dancehall, spooge, variants of rap that we invented before the Americans did. These are significant and they are major inputs across the world in the global move to fusion as music invention. And so we hold a place as a talent hub on the global stage. And 15 years ago, when I first did the measure at the request of WIPO for the case of Jamaica, I found that music contributed, in the case of Jamaica, about less than 1% of GDP. You're that talented, you're that capable of innovating. Less than 1% of your GDP. It needs to be somewhere up in the region of 5 and 6%. Music alone, not the copyright-based industries, which are up there, are at the 5 and 6%. But music in our region should be somewhere up in that zone if we're going to be serious about relying on its innovative capacity to develop our economies. And in the case of Jamaica, just under 3,000 jobs. That's less than 1% of total employment. And of course, output per capita of the music industry was above the national output per capita of Jamaica, about US $7,000 compared to US $5,000 in the case of Jamaica. And again in 2011, again at the request of WIPO, I looked at the data for Trinidad and Tobago. Once again, the figures come back at less than 1% of GDP. In an economy that is obsessively talking all the time about industrial restructuring and lamenting the country doesn't know what to do about diversification of the economy. Could you imagine? In 2018, that was 2,018 employees in the case of Trinidad and Tobago in 2011. And that was less than 1% of total employment. So you could see that what's happening there in both of these two major economies in the region is there are signals that we are severely underexploiting the capabilities of this iconic industry from an innovation standpoint. In the case of the OECS, again, the figures are the same, 0.69% of GDP, under 1%, and under 1% of total employment. Now, in all those cases, what I found when I actually did the studies was that although some significant supportive copyright laws are in place along the lines that Erica was describing, the music industry itself, the operators and so on, are part of a historical legacy of innovation without the benefit of significant supportive public, fiscal, and credit policies. The other thing I observed when I did those studies is that the estimates are probably a little bit low, undercounts, because of a couple of things I observed. One is we have no data on the industry. We have inadequate data because the industry is part of what is largely normally talked about as an informal sector, so to say. A big part of it is informal. Not all of it, but a big part of it. A large number of artists who ply their trade in the international market, which is where they make the bulk of their income, but they do not have to satisfy domestic income reporting requirements. So we don't have access to the figures on what they're really generating as value added. And then, of course, the governments in the region notoriously accord low priority to monitoring the activities of innovators. Official statistics across the board in the region provide no reporting on the efforts of innovators and the barriers they face and so on. Now, in addition to all of that, we looked on the input side of the industries across the regions the countries that I studied. And there's several things we found here. Again, the industry relies on the system of education to provide qualified researchers, experimenters, and so on, music information and so on. But it's largely informal. I mean, you have an iconic university in the region only now getting around to a faculty of culture, so to say. And the premier music, we are iconically known for music, but our iconic faculty is not a faculty of music in the way, say, Berkeley in Boston is a music university, or the New School for Social Research in New York, and so on. You know, so what we're good at, we have no formal systems for properly educating our people from preschool through to the tertiary, the systems required to put people into the workplace. And then we rely on musical instruments and capital infrastructure. And except for steel pan and the box speakers and so on, we import most of the musical instruments. But the stock of specialized plant and public infrastructure to support music, in particular, you could see it with respect to the carnivals, is dismally absent. There is no specialized public infrastructure that exists year-round and available to the carnival industry in Trinidad and Tobago. Every year they build up something and break it down. And in the rest of the country, that's in one place in Port of Spain. And in the rest of the country, where some of the nicest carnival activities take place, you simply have to rely on the streets. There is simply no understanding of the importance of specialized public infrastructure to support the development of this critical industry in our future. And then, of course, the musicians themselves have demonstrated a significant capacity to keep their business processes modern. They are beyond informality. They're highly organized. I remember my first exposure to Beanie Man and Shocking Vibes crew, and so highly organized, fantastic office facilities and so on, right? And they employ highly adaptive business processes in doing their work. But of course, when you are hamstrung by the other things negatives that I just identified, you could go so far as Beanie Man, but you can't go that far as Jamaica. And then supporting institutions, the financial institutions, all our research demonstrated very unsupportive and non-inclusive of our iconic music industry. The CMOs that are so critical to the ability of these industries to sell their wares, the various forms of copyright that the creators produce. They are small, they have limited capacity to create operating surpluses that are sufficient to invest in capacity building to service the needs of their clients. The IPOs are also small and under-resourced. I remember I went with Demeter to Singapore, and he took me to see the IPO office there. And I came out of the IPO office there shocked at the scale and the sophistication of the investments they have made in supporting their copyright-based industries. And then, of course, the notorious case of the courts and the legal enforcement systems Erica pointed to, with significant amounts of lethargy, minimal formalized training in copyright, broad knowledge of law, but limited specializations servicing the court and the enforcement system in terms of knowledge of intellectual property and its critical significance for the development of the industry and the countries. And unsupported by significant regulations needed to support a proactive competitive strategy. And then, of course, there's the issue of markets and market information. The music creators import inputs under price-taking conditions. Of course, we're small and you understand that. But we recognize that there is increasing digitization of music production and distribution technology. And we know that our local creators are very agile in keeping up with those. But the market information required to facilitate the development of our industry is very weak. So in all cases like that, I reported that although we have had several creators who have become relatively large global players, most Caribbean music creators, including those who try to produce sound recordings, are small, under-resourced, and informal operators with limited access to long-term capital assets. So enormous credit to them for the amount of creativity that they have displayed. And most of the long-term assets that I detected by my interviews across the Caribbean landscape are in the form of accumulated cultural knowledge and natural skill, and the intellectual property, of course, that they created in their innovation process. Now, in this most recent study that I did for WIPO on the nature of the macroeconomic conditions of music production, I also observed that there are a couple of characteristics that put creators and other domestic holders of copyright at a substantial disadvantage in the music supply, technical adjustment, and price formation process. The digitization, of course, is one. But there is a tendency for the operators, including their CMOs, to face a growing oligopolistic global digital streaming market with domestic laws and regulations that are way behind the curve, so to catch up. There is evidence of significant levels of user surplus, goes to some of the underpricing that was cited in one of the references by Erica. And there's a high degree of information asymmetry as people try to prosecute their rights in terms of adverse selection, the users having access to information that the owners of the rights cannot get in the process of rights administration. So that puts our industry at an enormous disadvantage. And if it's going to help us to pursue development in the way we need to, then all of these things have to be addressed by policymakers. Now, although the contributions to output, trade, and employment is small, what the Caribbean music industry is significant for lies in the fact that it produces a regular annual flow of leading musical innovations way out of proportion to its size and its resource base. Just credit that to the natural creativity of the operators involved. They may not be doing equivalent creative stuff with respect to the production of sound recordings, but when it comes to the production of music people like, they're right there with the rest of the world. And we need to invest more in building that capacity. It is the most important source, the music industry, the most important source of routine production of innovative capital in every Caribbean economy. So overall, what the data I have assembled over the years have demonstrated is that there is a huge and compelling public interest in facilitating music capital production in Caribbean economies. The industry keeps our focus on the optimal competitive strategy of these economies. They routinely every year practice piecewise continuous technical adjustment on the output side as well as on the input side. The industry successes indicate that if focused on capital production, Caribbean countries can become leading global players in the innovation process. Music is doing it. We can do it for music. We can boost what we're doing in music and do more in other areas, feeding off what the musicians are achieving. The industry also demonstrates that successful trade associated with optimal capital production-based competitive strategy is intra-industry trade. We export music, we import music, and by and large, we've demonstrated that with adequate supportive infrastructure, institutions, and so on, we can hold our own and in the end come out net of the game. And of course, it demonstrates that to scale up the successes of the industry, there are significant output and input conditions that need to be addressed by policymakers. Now, when you view the findings in that light, what you are forced to face is the fact that we are underinvesting radically in development of the music industry. To facilitate the investment in music capital production for development, there are some things that each country should consider doing, and I have focused on a few of them here. There is a full elaboration of this in the previous studies and in other work that we're doing. But one set of the policies must promote the production of music as domestic capital. We must speak to our society about the importance of doing what we are doing in music, the importance of using or produced music in domestic production and innovation, and the importance of exporting our music within the framework of intra-industry trade. That by itself, just building awareness and promoting it proactively as policy is going to bring enormous gains. And then the other set of policies must identify and remove barriers to music capital production for innovation. We have a number of barriers that we have found in our studies of the industry. People's skills and attitudes, that's an important thing. Not a little bit of that has to do with the attitude of the public as a whole to innovative music. I remember when I was young and the reggae was being introduced by the Rastafarians. The Rastafarians were also the most hated people in the Caribbean culture. And of course, when I was even younger, the Calypsonians had a similar experience. You know, if your sister talked to a steel band man, the family will cut off your hand, that sort of stuff. And then, of course, every day I encounter musicians who complain about the fact that credit to support their work is simply almost unavailable in the space. Absence of credit to complement their internal financing capacity is a critical barrier to the development of the industry. Information in terms of timely access to data on emerging technologies and markets, and access to expert advice, university-based advice, for example, about new forms of fusion that will work, that sort of stuff. Absence of that kind of information is a barrier. The absence of the industry infrastructure that I pointed to earlier, this is a huge barrier and needs to be addressed. Not a little bit of that has to do with infrastructure for experimentation and research. Musicians are notorious for being experimenters. They spend nights and nights practicing and trying stuff, and so they just live by experimenting. And we need to provide adequate public infrastructure to support that kind of effort. Not all of the innovation must be in the form of what traditionally is called R&D for manufacturing activity. Experimentation is a form of research too. And then we have this business of market distorting practices. Some of that has to do with barriers in the form of other forms of intellectual property that may limit the use of inputs into music creation. And then, of course, there's the problem of the information asymmetry that I pointed to, and the associated market dominance and monopolistic tendencies of some of the users of music as input into production of other services. And then all research really points to this, the biggest single problem that we have across the Caribbean, government policy, inadequate government policy. I never tire of telling this story of my experience with Jamaica back in 2005, when the government, having gotten our results, promised to develop some online facilities to support music investment, promotion, and exports. And 15 years after that, those facilities are still under construction on the Jampur website. They're still not there. So inadequate government policy affects all aspects of the music development, music innovation process, and it's perhaps the single biggest factor affecting forcing and generating this underinvestment in music capital production and innovation efforts. Now, to identify and remove the barriers, I've pinned down 4 critical things that we have to do. And the others are there. They are all important, but the most critical things I'm persuaded are these. The first, of course, is we've got to get our data systems right. We have to collect the necessary data on the barriers to innovation, music innovation and innovation generally, the barriers to capital production and innovation, confronting the innovative enterprises, including the music operators. And we need both survey data and administrative data to collect that information. For example, we could undertake a survey of innovative enterprises and introduce that into the official statistical efforts of our Caribbean statistical agencies, country specific. Then secondly, we need to monitor and eliminate information asymmetry. It's too big a problem for this most important of all our industries. In that context, we may need to establish, take a page out of the work we did in the Survey of Living Conditions in Jamaica. In order to support our understanding of poverty, we established the Derek Gordon Data Bank at Mona. And that's a good model. We could invest in a special purpose innovation data bank at UWI for data storage, data analysis, and information dissemination to support the elimination of information asymmetry and allow the music industry to breathe. And then we need to recognize that there was a pipeline of talent coming into the industry, even when we didn't like the fact that the pipeline existed. And if we want to formally bring all our citizens into that pipeline, we now need to make fundamental changes to our education system. We need to add a parallel skills intensive track, a TVET track, problem solving track to the existing academic track, providing for music specializations along this track. That's a critical change that we will need across the system. Put an end to this business of being preoccupied with academics in our education system when most of the academicians will die poor compared to successful musicians. We need to ensure that all students on these tracks have equal access to schooling of the same quality. So you kill the historical negatives of poverty and discrimination that has blocked the evolution of industries like music in our economies. We need to incorporate elements in the curriculum designed to produce the type of people that musicians are. Musicians are the one set of people in the region who are not victims of mental slavery. And you need to build into the curriculum information that produces those types of persons, self-confident graduates that mimic what our musicians are like. And then, of course, you have to elevate teaching to the premier and best paid profession outside of music, of course, because music generates its income globally, but within the local landscape, teaching to allow for the transmission of the critical skills needed for such an iconic industry to function. And then finally, you need to add a tertiary export component to the school system, including a component that drives access to things like agency and so on to support the development of music training exports. I mean, when a Caribbean musician leaves and goes to Berkeley to go to school, that's the US exporting education. And we live in an iconic hub of talent, and we can build tertiary education exports around music and get the whole world to come to the best music schools in the world, that is entirely possible. And then to improve the effectiveness of policy making and provide greater opportunity for producers of music and other forms of capital to share in the policy making process. Caribbean governments, Caribbean countries must confront the need to upgrade their governance model to feature three critical things: greater legislative control of lawmaking, taking the lawmaking fundamentally out of the hands of the executives of the region; greater opportunity for the public, including the musicians and so on, to routinely inform the lawmaking process; and three, greater legislative oversight of what the executives are doing across the region. And if we do all of these critical things that I mentioned, you will give the music industry a fresh start at becoming a significant global player in in an industry that's now more than 60 billion US dollars in size. And you will give your economy a big boost as the society learns to generalize the practices that the musicians have perfected over the decades. So that's a perspective that came out of the work that I did over the years for WIPO and UNTAD and on my own behalf. And I hope it will help Erica and John in organizing their advocacy in support of the development of this industry. So let me thank you and stop there.
Thank you, Vanus. Thank you very much. So it's Erica and John on behalf of the Association of Caribbean Copyright Societies. And just so the audience knows, this is made up of BizCap in Belize, COP in Trinidad and Tobago, COSCAP in Barbados, JCAP in Jamaica, and ECHO in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And collectively, we represent just over 10,000 members. We're running late. We have some questions, but what I want to do is we'll kind of collapse the panel and the question and answer together. And I want to invite in the first instance, Professor Rosalea Hamilton to give her feedback to the presentation by Vanus. Professor Hamilton is CEO of the Lasco Chin Foundation. She's been there since June 2018. She was vice president at the University of Technology, Jamaica, and was awarded a professorship in the Scotiabank Chair in Entrepreneurship and Development in 2008. She established and led the Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprise Alliance, a network of small business organizations for 10 years. She also established the Institute of Law and Economics in 1998 and worked as a consultant and public educator on trade, governance, gender, and other areas of economic and social development. She has taught at the graduate and undergraduate levels in Jamaica and the US. She was special advisor and policy consultant in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, and served as chief advisor to the Prime Minister of Jamaica. She's currently a board director for Lasco Manufacturing Limited and National Integrity Action, a corruption watchdog organization. She's also chair of the newly created Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance, a hub of philanthropy connections in the Caribbean region. Can you all mute, please? I know she also has a tremendous interest in the creative industries, and so I turn you over for a brief response from Professor Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Erica. And I want to thank COSCAP, ACCS, the SALISES, UWI, K-ville campus, WIPO, for this invitation and for putting together what I think is an excellent discussion about music innovation and economic development. I think Dr. James provided an excellent integration of these key issues that we absolutely need to focus on if we're talking about Caribbean economic development and the central role of innovation and the creative industries in driving this process. I think the potential barriers to the music capital production and the policy implications are spot on. I want to focus my comments on 2 of the 4 policy implications that he suggested, and I want to add a 5th policy implication that I think flows from the work that he's doing. My first comment speaks to the upgrade of the governance models. The reality now today is that there's major distrust in the system of governance. Our recent election results, both in Trinidad, 58% voter turnout, Jamaica only 37% voter turnout, speaks to some of that. But the LAPOP study, the Latin American Public Opinion Survey that's done every 2 years, in 2014, out of 25 countries had Jamaica's trust in local government at the bottom, lowest, 33%. In fact, very troublingly, in 2017, only 55.8% of Jamaicans was reported to have supporting democracy, while 56.4% supports military coups. That gives us a perspective that, this governance issues, we really have to think very carefully and creatively about it. It will take more than simply governments making policy decisions and even constitutional changes. It definitely requires the kinds of advocacy and activism that's implied. I found Vanus calling this event an advocacy event very important, because we need to turn what could be seen as academic forums into advocacy, because it's so important to move the needle. We've been talking about the importance for creative industry for decades in the region, and we haven't quite moved. So I think we need to pay attention to the advocacy and the activism that's absolutely necessary to build the capacity, to innovate, to monitor, to create this specialized infrastructure that Vanus was talking about, to be able to invest more in this music capital production that he talks about. And the nature and the type of advocacy is where we all need a voice. We need the voice of the musicians in the music industry. Erica talked about the support for the copyright in agencies. All of these need active support. And I suggest that the musicians do play a key role in being able to sensitize the public about the significance of good governance for development and for the development of the industry. And so musicians ought to become, and it's a big burden because we expect a lot of our musicians, but they are an influential force. But see themselves as advocates for change and as activists who are actively engaged in the process of shaping policy, and to team up with other activists in the region and within the countries in order to make change. So I think that it's in the self-interest of musicians, and I think it's that voice that's important for us to get these governance issues right. The second issue I want to talk quickly about is the upgrade of the existing schooling system. And Vanus talked about the tertiary education becoming an export component and the need to collaborate with foreign collaborators and directors. All of this suggests to me the need for relevant foreign trade policy. And I suggest that there needs to be this 5th conversation about the relevant foreign trade policy that's needed to remove the barriers. And I think some lessons from the past are important. The cultural provisions in the CARIFORUM EU EPA that was signed in 2008 was intended to provide 2 benefits: the market access for the entertainment services that would enable access to 26 European countries, the cultural cooperation provisions, the protocols on cooperation, cultural cooperation. All of that was supposed to deliver some changes. However, we didn't see the access to the EU markets. That was frustrated by a lot of the visa requirements and so on. The protocol on cultural cooperation didn't quite live up to the historic concession that we thought we got, right? And opening unprecedented cultural opportunities for Caribbean people. Didn't quite see that. And I think an important lesson is the absence of the kind of activism that I was talking about, and engagement that was required once we had those agreements in place. We needed activism to fund the implementation of those agreements. And it includes funding for non-state actors. That was a big part of the Cotonou Agreement. And we needed to have done all of that. We needed to have been talking about economic diplomacy, not traditional diplomacy. All of these things were needed. We didn't quite have it, and we have what we have today. I think this approach to trade policy is now urgent as we now consider that we're seeing the collapse of the Doha, the WTO Doha round of discussion since 2008, and the US skepticism about the World Trade Organization. It is in a state of flux. I always like to talk about what happens in 2003 with the Antigua and Barbuda internet gambling case, still not settled, although they won 21 million annually to deal with that. They didn't pay us any mind. We have to rethink the existing terms of global engagement. We have to put a foreign trade policy in place that takes account of our history, who we are, understand the important role of the music cultural industries in global trade, encourage active trade investment and finding new markets, finding new niches in a very active way. And we need economic diplomacy to do that. And so finally, I want to just comment on the point about the mental slavery and building self-confidence. Very, 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 very important. Key to increasing our capacity to compete. We need boldness and fairness. And I want to say that boldness and fairness, which our musicians and our cultural people tend to have, is lacking on the part of the policymakers. They themselves need to be bold. We have a lot of educated people coming out of our universities in our governments, but they're timid. They're conformist. They don't want to rock the boat. We need those boldness policymakers who are bold, who are able to tackle these issues in a very constructive way. And we also need to tackle this issue of the pride in who we are. I keep making this point. Right now, we want new markets. The fastest growing markets in the world pre-COVID was in Africa. If we see Africa and the history of Africa and so on, our relationship, our brothers and sisters in Africa, as somehow something to be ashamed of, we're missing global opportunities. We need to actively go into these markets, and our policy makers need to help to facilitate those opening with us. So I think for all of these reasons, Vanus is spot on about these kinds of policy prescriptions. And I just think that the activism and advocacy on the part of the citizen, individuals and organizations is now essential, especially in this COVID period where musicians and people in the cultural industries are looking for new opportunities to earn income. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Rosalea. I will now invite Dimitar to give his response. Dimitar Ganchev is Deputy Director of the Copyright Management Division in the Copyright and Creative Industries sector of WIPO. He works on issues related to the economics of copyright and related rights, copyright infrastructure and management, and in general, the potential of copyright for generating income streams and making a living. He is involved in economic studies, delivers capacity building on direct management of intellectual property assets in the creative industries, and develops public sector partnerships for the transfer of knowledge in the creative sector. Mr. Ganchev has been in charge of research projects in WIPO on establishing methodologies for assessing copyright impacts and providing evidence for policy making on copyright and creative industries. He is a national of Bulgaria. He holds a PhD in economics from the Sofia University of National and World Economy and an MA in international relations from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He is a founder member of the Bulgarian National Association on Intellectual Property. He has numerous publications on the creative industries, intellectual property, and foreign policy issues. He's a frequent speaker at major international and national events on creative industries and copyright. So Dimitar, if we can have your comments, please.
Thank you very much, Erica. And thank you, Dr. Marshall and Mr. Arnold and all of you colleagues for having me in this discussion. I'd like to take ACCS and SALISES also for this invitation and congratulate you on this wonderful acronym, ACCS. It sounds like the key to Eden. So a great acronym. Congratulations on that. You're extremely creative in the Caribbean. I have had the pleasure of knowing Dr. James for many years, and we have collaborated on many projects with him, such as the surveys that were mentioned, the development of methodologies, some of the IP and development issues, but most interesting has been my discussions with him on projects that we haven't yet undertaken and are to be undertaken in the future. So it comes as no surprise to me, this high quality of the report and the insightful analysis and recommendations that he's making. A lot has been said. I will also limit my remarks just to a few points. Starting with something which impressed me. You in the Caribbean are extremely self-critical. You're always very critical of yourself. And I think that transpires even in the comments which Professor James made. I think there's more to be proud about than to be critical about. You've got incredible resources and you've done much better than other regions in the world, in the developing world. So you have to build on that. And it's not just a question of repeating the difficulties, but focusing on the positive developments and how to take this even further. Now, to put things in a context, the studies which I'm aware of and that I have been involved in indicate that the music sector is not the biggest creative sector in the Caribbean. Everybody thought it would be the case, but none of the studies has indicated that music generates most of the value, employment, and trade in the region. The contribution of music to national development has been somewhat modest. However, in this creative economy in which everything is interconnected, music has numerous impacts in other economic areas. And I believe that perhaps a future study might look deeper into this. How much are the induced impacts by music in other sectors of the economy? And maybe we will get a different figure and a better idea of the driving force of music. Let's also not forget that a part of this impact is not quantifiable, and it is not in direct economic terms, but it returns in different ways to the national development of the country. Now, many of the problems that Professor James has analyzed and included in his report are not unique to the Caribbean. There are many other regions which are suffering and fighting with the same kind of issues. Export or die was the slogan of many countries around the world. If you don't export, you will die. So this was something which is typical for maybe 50% of the countries around the world. They want to export, otherwise they don't have enough incentives to develop their national economic structure. Now, I think that the lessons that we have learned from all of these other countries is that the solution to this involves, first and foremost, hard work. Working hard, this was the recipe that I've heard around the world. You need to put a lot of effort if you want to change things. And when you talk about music, clearly the report is very right about the need to focus into developing the human capital and the need to develop the infrastructure for the creative industries. Having creativity in society, which you have proven, is not sufficient. You need to monetize it. And to monetize it, you need an infrastructure. So building this soft infrastructure, for me, is the biggest challenge where effort needs to be put. Now, one very important aspect to me is that we need to consider things into a broader context. Music is part of the creative industries. And if you want to succeed in music or in the creative industries, you need to have a very clear strategy on how you want to achieve that. Countries which have excelled in this area have all benefited from very well thought through strategic approaches to this. And a strategy means that you're clear on where you want to go and how you want to go there, and it also includes a very solid financial framework. You cannot expect from the music industry on its own just to develop all the beautiful elements that were mentioned so far. You need to have a solid financial backing for this strategic program. And I believe that this is a program which needs to be a horizontal one. It is clear that creative industries is not just music, it's not just about the Copyright Office or the Ministry of Economics. It just concerns all the spheres of social life in the country. So that's why there needs to be a horizontal effort. And in my experience, it works best when there's a very clear government strategy on that, when there's a very clear policy which is backed by a financial commitment. Clearly, this is an effort by the public and the private sector. You cannot expect it to succeed with just one leg. We all have to go there at the same pace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Demeter. So I saved the best for last, which is Dr. Marshall. But since he's also going to do the wrap up, I thought we could take a couple questions now. And then I will ask Dr. Marshall to give his remarks and to wrap up. So the first question is from Nigel Campbell. And he says the data desert in Trinidad and Tobago and the lack of formalization of the sector stakeholders are a couple of problems affecting the growth of the music industry here. Strategic plans for the industry's growth are drawn up and ultimately hidden from stakeholders via the excuse that implementation will be too costly for the state. What would you suggest as top priority items for a public-private partnership to grow the industry, or would a public-private partnership not be advisable in Trinidad and Tobago? And I guess that could be Vanus or John, given their specific familiarity with Trinidad and Tobago. So Vanus, would you like to offer a response?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge the debt of gratitude that the region owes to Demeter. And I admire his comments that he made, as well as Professor Hamilton. I think what's captured in the comments of both is that the first public-private partnership we need is one to create a proper framework of good governance so that all our voices are heard in the discussions about what is to be done, what we know, and what to make of what we know. And as it is now, in the context that we have, whenever good ideas come forward, governments get to do with impunity what the person who wrote the question asked, observed, which is to shelve, or whatever you have to say. So to avoid the shelving, you've got to get good governance in place so that government has to do what we want. We as musicians, we as citizens and owners of Caribbean society. That's the first critical thing. And then once you get that right, and you put the education system in place for the talents to flow and the research to be done and so on, the industry will bloom and go. So I think that's the central point I would like to make in response to that kind of pretty broad question.
Thank you. I'll give a comment from Sarah Shaw. Sarah notes that barriers also include global gatekeepers of culture, such as streaming playlist curators who relegate Caribbean music to world music and do not expose Caribbean music to the algorithms on which most music services now rely. So that was a comment from Sarah, and I suppose a comment on the fact that we're now in the age of the digital music industry, and we need to pay attention to how we respond to that, and to also understand, as she notes, the new gatekeepers, so to speak. There's a query from Natalie Rochester, and I will use that as a leeway to Dawn. She said it would be great for Vanus to share more on improving the data collection systems for music and other creative industries. And I agree, but I use it as a leeway to Dawn because yes, we have the new faculty here, which is fantastic. But coming out from what Vanus said and other observations is that we need to have the cross-disciplinary aspect. In other words, we need to see economics in there as well. And this issue of data collection and so on, I think initiatives such as having an observatory and really building the research from an economic perspective to inform policy is also necessary. And I put you on the spot, Salises. I certainly see a role there. As Vanus pointed out, even though we have the reputation for our music industry and creative industries generally, from an academic perspective, we have not really taken the charge. So I'm going to turn over to Don, ask him for his comments and to do the wrap up. Thank you. Unmute, Don.
Thank you very much. I seem to be faced with the unenviable task of folding remarks with a wrap up and somewhere in there answering the direct question that Erica just put. So what I would do is I'll try to do my honest best. I want to begin by thanking everyone again for their contributions. I don't know what the rest of the participants who are online and listening are thinking, but I do know that already we have been given plenty food for thought, and there'll be some interesting perspectives that do not well mask the tensions in the contributions coming from all of you. There are tensions that do not necessarily jar against each other, but I think they slide discrepantly against each other, up against each other. By that I mean, where one speaker ends off, the other person sheds greater light. And that is what I enjoyed about the discussion, including even the very brief remarks that Demeter offered, reminding us of our strengths and also indicating ways in which ultimately, and I mean, I think he summed up that very point that Vanus kept making, that ultimately, you know, we have to, the role that the state has to play in providing leadership is going to be critical. Even if when we talk about private-public partnerships in whatever capacity, it really does come down to the state's vision and the state taking the lead and championing such an approach. So even the idea of market-led development, I tell my students, comes from the state providing leadership in building market order and ensuring that there is a regulatory system in place, et cetera, et cetera. So there's never a time, it will be ahistorical to so suggest, there's never a time that the state doesn't demonstrate leadership. And when I heard Rosalea speaking about a clear foreign trade policy, I thought it was very critical. Again, this is about state leadership. And I really think that what came out today is a question of state posture. When Erica spoke about the informality, let me get it right, the informality trap. And in my own work, I talk a lot about high-level equilibrium traps that we find ourselves in as a region. By that I mean, what was bequeathed to us arising from the colonial experience where models of political economy or models of development have remained oriented towards the production of one or two exports, heavy reliance on tourism, heavy reliance on services, largely to do with the fact that we've had historical predilection or preference towards services. It reflects, in a way, a kind of status quo satisfaction with keeping things the way they are and the way they were. And in many ways, the nature of, or the balance of the global political economy for much of the time we've experienced political independence coincided with a strategy where you rely on one or two exports, rely on the discretionary spend on North American visitors and European visitors to build our development and trade outlooks. But the world has rapidly been changing, and it's been doing so the last 30 years with the end of the Bananas Protocol, the end of preferential access, etc., the establishment of the WTO, what that meant, facing up to the cold wind of international competition. We've been marking time for, I would say, from the dawn, well, the closing decades of the 20th century. We've been marking time. We've been, I know Demeter asks us not to be hard on ourselves, but ultimately, there's a problem constellation that we have to confront, right? There's a problem constellation to do with our development strategy and where the emphases seem to lie. So there's a great amount of, if we can praise, we praise our governments collectively for the collective investment and subsidy, corporate subsidy, towards the growth of the tourism and international business sector strategy. I think most of them have done very well in helping the private sector, marketing the product, getting bums in airplane seats, subsidizing what is required to make the tourism industry particularly work and thrive within the constraints of its own expression. I say that because critics would always make the point that there's much more we can do with tourism. But insofar as it has accounted for, to a large part, throughout the Eastern Caribbean and parts of the wider Caribbean at least, a great contribution to our GDP development, our economic development, and to jobs, we commend our governments for doing that. However, if you look at some of the other corollary services, corollary developments that could have arisen out of this flying geese tourism model, okay? And we focus on the music industry. There is no single Caribbean country that has developed a music industry. They've given lip service to it. Cuba remains the only country that has institutionally built up a music industry. And when the question was put about having data, so one speak about a data desert, and Erica put the question about about the role that SALISES and research institutions generally can play. While people go out and generate data, we need to know that within the different country spaces that you have information and analysis systems with samples of indicators in place. So that, for example, I'll just give a small example. In the development of the music industry in Cuba, you can access an information and analysis system that speaks to the following indicators: composers and writers, lyricists, performers, solo vocalists, solo instruments, backstage instruments, orchestra directors and conductors, choral directors, disc jockeys, electronic music DJ producers, poets, musical comedians, musical animations directors, orators, first dancers, solo dancers for music shows, core dancers, musical ventriloquists, circus artists. I'm just giving you a snapshot of some basic information that the Cuban government collects and imagine if you were in the University of Havana, what that means for your research. Now, I've given you that to give you a sense of the desert that researchers within think tank organizations, doesn't have to be university, faces when they try to delve into our societies to get from it meaningful data to begin to do the building blocks towards policy advising. We are starved. The data that Vanus collects and produces in his work comes from grubby handwork of Vanus himself, cobbling together, parsing through what little he can get out of our national systems. You will find that we, researchers, go then to these sources, to the CIA fact book, to the national statistics, whatever they are, and we try to build in on that. The point I'm saying, I want to make more concretely is if you have our countries turning towards an industrial policy, outlining the strategies of that industrial policy. So you can have a national industrial policy where you're going to promote tourism, but you want to promote a tourism that's going to be with forward and backward linkages with the economy, that's going to have trade implications and how we engage the rest of the world. So you have to be thinking about, okay, the cultural industries. And when we say the cultural industries, a lot of studies, consultancies, and so on have been done, but lip service has been paid to actualizing a cultural industry. Again, this has to do with not having an industrial strategy oriented towards giving birth to the rise of the synergies that are required. So I made a few notes. And around this whole idea of development of industrial policy and strategies, because one of the things that came out of the presentations is that music, the potential for income generation through trade and intellectual property is rich. We also know that the process of the value chain of the music industry allows for, if we can develop in ways in which we can contribute to the value chain of the music industry, we would go a long way to achieving success in SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals 8, that speaks to decent jobs and economic growth. Sustainable Development Growth 9, that speaks to industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Sustainable Development Goal 11, that speaks to sustainable cities and communities. A lot of our Caribbean countries in a wider development or wider industrial strategy should be geared towards urban regeneration. We need to be talking about urban regeneration. We need to be talking about new cities, building new cities, of which music becomes a critical component to it. Right now, as it stands, there's a low contribution to music exports in our trade balance. So however we look at whichever society, whichever country we want to look at, music in relation to its exports is very low in the trade balance. And this is juxtaposed against the fact that there is international approval of our music. So it's a curious paradox, Demeter, in terms of why we would be a little bit animated and passionate about the need to do better. And that is because we're faced with a curious paradox. That is, on the one hand, there's a global, truly global appeal for our music and our musical styles. We're not talking about an international appeal. We're really talking about global appeal. We've seen deliberate efforts in parts of Africa to grow a music industry that's seen Afrobeats now become a sort of global influence, a global impact. A lot of our musicians here are, as it were, I prefer to call them, they're not so much entrepreneurs as they're resilient buccaneers, battling against all kinds of setbacks and structural barriers to achieve what they have achieved. And the danger is that for each of one of them that's gained success, we've hardened our position that we can leave to the vagaries of the market the question of our music industry. So the informality trap that Erica speaks of can only be overcome with a turn towards designing a deliberate music industry with innovation clusters that links local businesses with global markets and supply chains, that informs trade policy. We should be across the region enriching the culture of record labels. We should be also seeking to promote investments in attracting direct capital and internalizing technology in the countries. We should also take as critical reviewing the existing legal frameworks related to all processes of the music industry value chain. We should be doing all those things if we're to get past the informality trap, which really is a euphemism for saying that we have left the music industry in the Caribbean to survive on its wits. And leaving it to survive on its wits means that when a university takes an initiative like establishing a faculty of culture, we establish structure without ROUTES roots and RWTS roots, meaning we see the need intellectually to give recognition to the vibrancy of the region, which is our culture. But without the sense of any national development plans anywhere in the region on how to build this thing from the ground up, we put ourselves in a position where we again have to be railing at governments, railing at policymakers, admonishing through our research, etc., bemoaning. The horizontal networks that I heard one of you speak to, the horizontal policy networks, can only emerge following a deliberate plan with a capital P, led by the state and including all these stakeholders, the private sector, intelligentsia, trade experts, etc., dedicated education service providers, dedicated to make sure we build this industry from the ground up. I listed to you the sense of the detail in relation to information systems created in Cuba, compatible with trying to achieve certain targets in relation to growing the music industry in Cuba. Cuba has been designated a music island. And that's not by accident. This is a deliberate strategy. And I think we have to embrace the idea that post-COVID futures should not just be restricted to focusing on the green economy and the rest of it, but we must give credence and detail to what the orange economy would look like. I think there's a lot of rhetoric around orange economy, but actual strategizing on what that will look like. How do we build it from the ground up? How do we access capital? How do we source global sources of capital to source finance? These are things that we need to be getting involved in as we engage futures and sustainable futures. And with those few comments and remarks, I want to say, I think that this has been a wonderful session. It's caused us to think about development proper. It's caused us to recognize that getting past the informality trap, sorry, Erica, I'm going to work with that. Getting past the traps that we've set ourselves means that we have to confront a haughty anti-industry coalition of experts and policymakers and say to them, it's a brand new world post-COVID or post-lockdown. We are told that our current models of political economy have become upended. It's about livelihoods. Music is a site for great artistic and entrepreneurial expression. In fact, indeed, in today's world, The only thing that's booming is the biotechnology industries, the pharmaceutical industry, and the music industry. Those are the only things that are booming right now. And those will be the platforms for value creation going forward. And if we're to build a development strategy based on those existing platforms of value creation, then now is the time to start thinking about deliberately developing a music industry as an expression of developing our creative industries, and not to speak of it in any generic sense of an alphabet soup of many things. So thank you all again. I think this has been very productive, and I hope, Erica, that this satisfies SALISES involvement, satisfied what ACCS has been trying to achieve. I must say now publicly, now that we're at the end, that a lot of this passion and the ideas for having something like this really was the brainchild of Erica. She came to me, we are kindred spirits, and over here at SALISES, we talk about development futures all the time, and sustainable futures. From the time she said it, I realized there was a lacuna, there was a gap. We've not really looked at it. And the social in our economic studies just need to stretch more. The economic in our Institute of Social Economic Studies need to broaden its scope. So from the time Erica contacted me, I saw the point, and I was just saying, yes, 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 tell us how we can get it done. And so I want to thank her for helping us to now wear a lens that's a little bit more sharper in focus. And I'm sure that Rosalie and Vanus will be happy